Welcome to this webinar hosted by the Freedom Association. Thank you everyone for joining so far. There are still one or two people who will be joining us as we go along, but that won't interfere with our proceedings. The first news I have to tell you is that Sammy Wilson, who as you will know was announced as a panelist, is still a panelist, but because of developments with the withdrawal agreement, he has been detained and is going to join us later on. So we will start with Phillip Davis to speak first, and then Esther will follow Phillip. I think I'm probably right in saying, and it's fairly unusual with any political topic these days, that there's probably not a single person in the country who doesn't understand the term lockdown and what is meant by it, and probably has a view on it, whether they agree with it, disagree with it, think it's gone too far, not too far enough. It's literally taken over the lives of the whole country. One might even say the whole world. So we're going to knock this topic around this evening. And our first speaker is the Member of Parliament for Shipley, the inaugural chairman of Better Off Out. I'm sure he's well known to all of you. And I'm going to ask Phillip to speak for a few minutes to kick us off. So over to you, Phillip Davis.
Thanks ever so much, David, and thanks everyone for joining us this evening. Look, I was one of those people who, at the start, back in March, seems a long time ago now, was prepared to give the government the benefit of the doubt with regard to lockdowns, that we didn't really know what we were facing, and the government made the case, which I thought was a perfectly reasonable one at the time, that they needed time to get extra capacity into the NHS. And so I was prepared to go along with what the government were doing. I thought, that seems fairly reasonable. Then as soon as they've managed to get the extra capacity into the NHS with the Nightingale hospitals and all the rest of it, then presumably we could ease back on some of these restrictions. That was the way I saw it. But unfortunately, either the government didn't do what it said it was going to do and get extra capacity into the NHS, or it's got the taste of power so much, and the power of interfering in every aspect of everybody's lives so much that it wants to carry on doing that for much longer than is necessary. I'm a Conservative for one particular reason, and that is that I believe in freedom. Hence why I'm proud to be associated with the Freedom Association. And it seems to me the cornerstone of being a Conservative is that you believe that individuals make much better decisions for themselves, for their families, and for their local communities than the state can make for them. That seems to me to be at the heart of what being a Conservative means and what the heart of freedom is all about. And yet we found ourselves in a situation where every aspect of our lives is now being determined by the government, by Public Health England, and Lord knows who elected them to run the country, but that's what they seem to be doing at the moment, and by Matt Hancock. And quite frankly, it's got to something when, my mum, who she will be absolutely appalled that I declare her age tonight, which is 77 years old. It's come to something when my mum can't be trusted to make her own mind up as to whether or not she goes round to her grandchildren's house to see them, and has to, in effect, wait for the permission of Matt Hancock to tell her whether she can or can't do that. She's more than capable of making that decision for herself, from weighing up the risks that might be involved and making an informed decision. She doesn't really need Matt Hancock to tell her whether she can or can't make that decision, but that's literally the situation that we are in, that she hasn't been able to see her grandchildren for months because Matt Hancock won't let her. And I've really been scared, to be perfectly honest. I found it very chilling how easily the British people have been prepared to, in effect, give up their freedoms because the state has managed to frighten them enough into giving them up. I found that very, very frightening at how easily the government can do that in a liberal Western society that we are. They're a freedom-loving country like the UK. And it wouldn't be so bad if, well, it would probably, but it's made even worse by the fact that the decisions that the state are making quite predictably are, on the whole, inconsistent, often ludicrous, make absolutely no sense, have no scientific basis behind them, and are completely arbitrary. So as we've seen with things like, 10 o'clock curfews, the rule of 6, these sorts of things that you can, you could go into a betting shop, but you couldn't go into a casino. All these sorts of ridiculous rules, they don't make any sense anyway, which is why I said earlier on that individuals can make much better decisions for themselves than the state can make for them. If actually you left people to make decisions and asked them to make responsible decisions, they would almost certainly make more sensible decisions than the government are making for them with these arbitrary rules and restrictions. And people say, oh, well, not everybody's responsible people behave irresponsibly. Well, I'm sure some people do. And of course, that's always the argument of socialists, that they need to tell everyone what to do because the people can't be trusted for themselves, a view that I don't share. But even if you take that view, people who act responsibly aren't following the rules anyway. So what's the point in all of these rules when the people who are irresponsible aren't following them anyway, and the people who are following the rules are responsible and could be therefore trusted to make sensible decisions themselves without having to have the dead hand of the state making all of these individual decisions for them. So, I'm really worried about what's happening, the desire that the government seems to have for keeping these rules on for longer and longer. We've got to remember as well, I should add, just as an aside, that the mortality rate for coronavirus is around about 0.5%. So 99.5% of people who get it survive it. And even if you get to the average age of people who have died of coronavirus is, I think, 82. And if you get to the age of life expectancy in the UK, which is around about 81, if you get to the age of life expectancy in the UK and you catch coronavirus at that point, you have still got a 90% chance of surviving it. And yet, on the back of those figures, we have literally restricted people's freedoms to an extent that we've never seen before, and we've collapsed our economy. And I just think that the disproportionate actions of the government can't possibly be justified. And if the Freedom Association is to stand for anything, it's got to stand against these arbitrary restrictions which are interfering in every aspect of all of our lives.
Thank you very much indeed, Philip. And thank you to all of you for joining us on this TFA webinar on the lockdown. My name's David Nuttall and I'm the chair for the evening. And it's my pleasure to chair this webinar on behalf of the Freedom Association. And if you're not a member of the Freedom Association, you can join. Simply go to tfa.net and click on the button marked to join at the top of the page. And for less than the price of a pint of beer a month, you could be a member of the Freedom Association.
If you can get one.
If you can get a pint of beer, you can't if you live in tier 3. Now, can I ask you to put your thinking caps on? Because once all the panelists have spoken, and just a reminder for those who've joined us since I introduced Philip, Sammy Wilson has been delayed in joining us because of the developments today with regard to the border arrangements surrounding Northern Ireland and the withdrawal agreement. And so he's busy having a briefing and hopefully will be joining us later. But once we've heard from our panelists, I will be inviting questions, of course. So if you've got a question, please do put it in the chat, and we'll try and get through as many as we possibly can in the next hour or so. Our second speaker is the Right Honourable Esther McVey MP, the Member of Parliament for Tatton. Well known again to you all, the former Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, former Minister of Employment, and of course now the leading light behind the blue collar conservatism movement. We are very fortunate to be able to have Esther join us this evening. She's one of the hardest working politicians in Westminster, and I think it's fair to say her time is at a premium. She's very, very much in demand, and we're very fortunate to be able to have secured her for this evening's webinar. So I very much look forward to hearing from Esther, and Esther, over to you.
Oh, thanks very much, David. Now, look, I don't want to repeat what Philip said there, because I agree with his reasoning and rationale. So what I'd like to do is maybe look at it from a different angle and take you on a slightly different journey down a timeline, sort of from early March, late February. So in late February, through the blue collar conservatism movement, we were going to a different pub a week, speaking with people, signing people off, people who'd been Labour voters all their life, who voted for the Conservative Party at the general election. That was only a year ago as well. They'd come on board, and we were meeting them in clubs and pubs and gathering up that support. And then you could see, as the news came over, that COVID was around, the virus was around, looking at what had happened in China, a bit of a time delay as we watched it, thinking maybe it wasn't going to come over to the UK. But you could see live events slowing down, people weren't going out to markets and stores. And I remember thinking, we're not going to be holding another pub event. The last one was in Oldham. We're not going to be doing it. How am I going to continue to connect, communicate and speak with people? So straight away, we set up our Blue Collar Conversations podcast. And I did that not only to reach out to these new blue collar conservatives, but also very much to chronicle in sort of real life time what was happening as the country went into lockdown. What impact was that going to have on a whole array of people in different sectors, different industries, different businesses, different ages, different health brackets, you name it. And so each week we did a different podcast on a different situation. And you could see sort of the disparities between online businesses and social businesses. You saw there's our bell, we're in Parliament for the end of the day. It's not another vote, is it? Oh, it's okay, but we're okay. We've cast ours. And you could see what was happening. So you could see what was happening to the hospitality sector, what was happening to the pub sector, and this sort of the difference in outcome. At the same time, I also looked at what were the health figures, what were the health implications of COVID and of sort of non-COVID health implications through lockdown. And this really is something that has to be now examined. You've got the ONS report saying there will be 200,000 deaths because of lockdown, non-COVID related. You've got a new Bristol University report coming out saying there will be 560,000 deaths. That actually report was done a few months later on through lockdown and non-COVID. So you can balance up the deaths. We've had 60,000 from COVID, but what's going to happen because of that? You saw 25 million GPs appointments lost because of lockdown, 19 million dental appointments lost because of lockdown. So far, an increase in 1 million people unemployed. And equally, look at what's happened with sort of university students, look at what's happening with the education in school, look at what's happening with kindergarten and primary schools. So you've got to look at the whole of the sort of the COVID and the lockdown in its entirety. And that is why, a bit like Philip, back in March, I voted for these emergency powers that the government felt it needed then, because we did not really know anything about COVID. But as time has passed on and you see who are the most vulnerable, the over 70s, those with underlying health conditions, those who are obese, we could, if we are a freedom-loving, democratic country, could have taken those decisions, clear, concise messages, what you needed to do, who you needed to protect, what you needed to do yourself. We could have done that and kept the country open, working, and free as a nation. But instead, we've gone into the most severe of lockdown that we've ever seen. And when you see that the actual economy has contracted by the most it has ever contracted in 300 years, you now have to look at what are the long-term implications, the long-term impact of a government stopping people working, stopping people interacting, and stopping, the country working. And I'll just end on this note, because I know there's lots of questions. I looked at not just me, lots of people did. Philip did, David did, you guys who are joining us tonight will have looked at the implications against democracy itself. Look how we're now being governed with emergency powers, which means we're not really debating, questioning, voting against what's coming through the House. Look at the House with minimal people in the main chamber, not really being able to challenge what's being said, not being able to hold debates, not being able to challenge ministers. We're not even voting in a way where we can catch somebody's eye or ear. Look at how whether it's written parliamentary questions aren't being answered on time. Look at how letters aren't being answered. And so for me, how do we get back to a proper functioning democracy and not remain in emergency powers and something that seems like a very statist dictatorship? And I think that long-term effect on democracy is going to be huge. And how do we roll back the power from a small number of people who have got it?
Well, thanks very much indeed, Esther. Now, I'm here in Bury at the moment, and we're in Tier 3. And I did see a headline in the paper, or obviously on the internet these days, saying that the police would be stopping people at the border, crossing over from Tier 2 Yorkshire to Tier 3 Lancashire, which is actually, funnily enough, is something I've been proposing for quite a long time, that there ought to be border checks between Yorkshire and Lancashire. So there are perhaps one or two good things coming out of this, and there are perhaps some things that we ought to think about keeping in place once these restrictions are finished, so that the idea of a permanent border force around Yorkshire to only allowing people who can speak the language and be able to communicate properly with the natives, it seems a very sensible idea. But I just wondered if perhaps Philip and Esther could give us some idea of the without giving details of personal things which would be private, confidential, that they've been told, but what's been happening actually in their own constituencies, because they're both, although they're nationally well-known figures, of course, they're both constituency MPs as well. And so we're just genuinely interested, and I'm sure those watching would be interested to know how it's impacted in Shipley and Tatton.
Well, if I just to go first, David, it's certainly impacted me in Shipley a lot more than it has Esther in Tatton. I mean, in Shipley, we sort of suffer the misfortune of being part of Bradford Council, which is a misfortune on a number of levels. But the main one is that Bradford's had very high levels of infections, and so even though in Shipley our levels have been much lower, we've been sort of sort of thrown in with Bradford and had the same restrictions, which has been as popular in my area as finding a rattlesnake in a lucky dip, to be perfectly frank. And it's, you know, my constituents. I mean, people aren't taking any notice. We've been in a sort of a extreme lockdown in my constituency in the Bradford district for months now, months and months and months. You know, people at the start, you know, they thought, well, these people know what they're doing. This fella's called Professor somebody, and this fella's called Sir Patrick so and so. They must know what they're doing. And as time's gone on, they've realised they haven't got the first idea what they're talking about, to be perfectly honest. I mean, if you remember, you know, at the start, you know, for wearing a face mask was a waste of time. Now, if you get off the sofa without a face mask on, you're going to drop dead, according to the latest advice. You know, to start with, we didn't need any restrictions on international travel. Now you've got to quarantine if you come back from virtually anywhere. And as time's gone on, my constituents have realised that actually, rather than all of this being very, you know, clever people who know what they're doing, they've realised that these people haven't got the first idea what they're talking about. They're making it up as they're going along. And so as a consequence, you know, people are getting very, very frustrated, and gradually they've been ignoring the rules because, you know, they just can't put their lives on hold in that way. So it's getting quite ugly, to be perfectly honest. And you know, we're in tier 3 in West Yorkshire, and if it's not reviewed, our cases are going down quite rapidly. They're now much lower than London, which is in tier 2, which doesn't go down very well either. So if there isn't an adjustment next week when the first review takes place, I think, you know, things are going to get pretty ugly in my neck of the woods.
And I'll give you, we're in tier 2, so it's slightly different, but let me give you an example of, I've got a pub business in my constituency, and it has been going for 200 years. It's in charge of 250 pubs right across the northwest and going into Wales. It's 6th generation of owners, and it has never ever closed any of its pubs through world wars and also the Spanish flu of 1918, and yet it has closed its doors now. Out of those 250 pubs, there's only 84 that are now opened. And I mention this because in, you know, whether it's in the countryside or in other places, the pub really is the community for a lot of people. So it's not just about the pubs are closed, you can't get a pint, those people don't have a job. But actually in some places, that is the only place somebody might go to meet anybody. So if you're talking about rural isolation or just, you know, community or people doing something, it's really ripping the heart out of a lot of those areas. But when you get told none of these pubs had ever closed for 200 years for those absolutely event turning you know, wars and the Spanish flu, it makes you question how different COVID is and was, and how different it has been viewed now to key things that had happened before then. I think my area went eerily quiet for a period of time, particularly that sort of March, April, May. I remember speaking to the local police then and now. I stay in touch with them. They said, you know what, if anybody even went out for 2 pieces of exercise, the police would get a phone call and say people are breaking the law. They said, now we know there's all kinds of house parties going on and various things that shouldn't be happening, and we don't get a call at all. So I think Philip's quite right. I think people followed the rules for as long as they could, and then when they began questioning them because of the arbitrary nature, like my next door neighbour couldn't have seen his grandkids, but if he had to put his house up for sale, anybody could have come round, and the grandkids as well. So I think people started to find a way around the rules. And I think what I will say, we do know that prohibition doesn't work, and people start finding a way around things and doing things differently. And what I've looked and I've observed, and I do believe will be the case, there is the rise now of a black economy. People who are being deprived of the livelihood think I can't pay my bill, think I will lose my home, and don't see why a barber could shave a beard, as it were, but somebody who had a beautician's couldn't do a sort of a beauty treatment. They then start doing it their own way. And the only reason I think what I saw from March onwards, I definitely think there has been a rise in the growth of the black economy. In the Times last week, there was a report, they said the Bank of England couldn't account for £8 billion There was another report this weekend. They said it's actually gone up to £50 billion. They don't know where that is. So that's either people stashing money under their bed, concerned about where the country's going to go next, or that is people are dealing with cash, getting on with their lives, and a black economy is growing, which is something we do not need going forward. And added to that, most people will say that the insurance companies haven't covered themselves in glory throughout this period of time, not stumping up when people did have business interruption insurance, and now people are going into, as I said, I think a black economy, which is what prohibition invariably does.
Well, that's great. Thanks very much. Now, we've had lots of questions come in now, so we're going to start whizzing through these. I'm going to try and deal with as many as we can. So I'll quickly read out the questions and then ask Philip and Esther if they could just perhaps one of them reply to each one in turn. So we're starting with Mr. Ian Taylor, who asks this question. It starts to look as though some lobbyists, especially those of a puritanical disposition, are pushing for retention of some controls as the new normal. Everything from pub hours to pop-up cycle lanes and even mask wearing on public transport. Is this just blatant taking advantage of the situation?
Yes, I agree. I mean, you know, these wallers at Public Health England in particular, they're fanatics. You know, they're absolute fanatics. They don't want you to do anything. If they had their way, they'd have these restrictions in permanently. I think if they got half a chance. I mean, we've already had some of them saying, oh, well, you know, even with the vaccine, we're still going to have mask wearing and social distancing for the whole of next year as well. I mean, you know, these people want to run everybody's lives. They want to tell people what they can eat, what they can't eat, you know, what they can do. This is perfect for them. This is heaven for them, and they will desperately fight to keep these restrictions as long as possible, and they'll come up with all sorts of cock and bull reasons why we need to keep them in perpetuity. And it's really important that we resist them. You know, politicians have got to stand up to these public health fanatics, we need to have a battle royal next year about this, because yeah, so I agree with that premise.
Well, you do always have a percentage of the public who always think they can save you from yourself, that they know better what you should be doing than you know, and we've got to get past that. If we believe in the individual taking responsibility for their own actions, knowing what they want to do, we have to get back to that space as best as possible.
Now, a quick question from Mr. Martin Culip. Apologies if I've pronounced that incorrectly. After a year of constantly scaring people to ensure compliance with restrictions, how difficult is it now going to be for the government to unscare them?
Well, I think that's going to be a huge task at hand. Maybe they didn't understand at the start how easy it was going to be to scare people. And we did all follow the rules, didn't we, to the letter. But this is the ultimate in selling fear, isn't it? It's you're going to die. This isn't any, I mean, this is what they've said. If you do not do, this is what will happen to you. And also the guilt, if it isn't you who might die, you could, you know, kill a member of your family, somebody close by, somebody who you love. And it was treated like a campaign, a fear campaign, rather than an information giving or government giving advice. How they're going to come out of it is going to be incredibly difficult. I guess that's why it's all now about the vaccine will be there to save you, which is a separate entity that's going to come in and protect you, because I don't think words alone would have been able to have removed the fear. And I think that's why now is a massive promotion of the vaccine.
Now, a question from Lindsay Jenkins. Now, Lindsay states that she spent the first 6 months of the pandemic out of the UK, over in New York and Florida, and asks, how far does this government, our government, note what other countries are doing? Does it take any notice at all? In most parts of the United States, they were never locked down as much as in the UK. Indeed, there were riots as attempts to close businesses and lawsuits. Life was nearly normal as it is today, despite the continuing pandemic. It is interesting how the different countries of the world have dealt with this. And I wondered whether our panelists thought about whether this pandemic had been dealt with in a better way in any other countries in the world. Philip, what's your view?
Well, I mean, I think, as usual, what people do is they point to other countries that are doing what they agree with. And so if a country is doing a severe lockdown, then they'll point to that country as being the country that we should be following, rather than perhaps Sweden that was doing something very, very different. I'm sure they have looked at what other countries have done, but they've decided to go with the countries that were doing things that they wanted to do, rather than looking at other countries who were doing something different to what they wanted to do. I think, but I presume that it was always that's inevitable in politics, I guess.
Thank you. Now I have to read this next question out because it's from someone with the surname of Gwyneth Rolfe. Can the panel please answer the question about the suggestion that airlines, venues and businesses might use coercive means such as vaccine passports to encourage vaccine take-up? Gwyneth's medical history gives her cause to not want to take the risk, and I'm sure there'll be others in this position, but Gwyneth states that she's an academic and a musician, and she has to travel in connection with both of her responsibilities and her pursuits. So there will be a lot of people in this position who are worried that they might be forced to have a vaccine. I wonder what Philip and Esther may think about that question.
Well, that definitely does seem to be the path that we're on. That people will be able to say, well, you can't come into this country, or you can't come into this restaurant, or you can't, I don't know, attend a school or whatever it is, and therefore, vaccines could be mandated, which is something we've never had before. And I think even if people agree with vaccinations, even if they've taken the MMR and we believe that, agree with it, I think the speed with which this vaccine has come forward, I think people are saying, well, hang on a sec, do we know what the unintended consequences will be? Do we know its efficacy? And as Philip mentioned before, the survival rate of COVID, can we not balance up that ourselves? Can we not decide whether we want to take the risk of being ill or whether we want to take a vaccine, which to a lot of people would not seem to have been tested as much as they would have liked? And that's people who aren't even anti-vaxxers or against vaccines. They're just saying this one seems to have come forward very quickly, and we've moved into a position which we've never had before, a form of mandation. So, I do think that is a massive infringement of people's liberties and choice.
Can I just say on this? I think this is a very difficult one, and I think because it clashes. Sometimes you find this where you have two principles that you agree with, which clash with each other, and you've sometimes got to work out which of them are the most important. So. I think we can all agree, I hope we can all agree that it would be an outrage for the government to mandate everybody to take a vaccine. And I'm not entirely sure how they could do it anyway, aside from strapping everybody down forcibly. You literally can't force people to take a vaccine. It's not practical to do that. And it certainly would be wrong in principle. But the other side of it, which is, I think, what people, and what's been alluded to in the question, is that whilst the government won't force people to take it directly, that people will feel forced into taking it because they won't be able to do anything unless they've taken it. And of course, this is where there's another quite important principle which perhaps clashes, and that is that I believe, and I'm sure the Freedom Association believe in the principle of private property. And of course, if you own sort of premises, and you want to set particular rules for who can come into your premises or not, then a belief in freedom will be to say, well, you've got the right to decide who can come into your premises. And so if an airline says, well, you're not coming onto my plane unless you've taken a vaccine, In many respects, you say, well, it's their plane. If they want to set those rules and perhaps turn away customers and whatever, if that's what they want to do, then it's their plane. They've got the right to do it. Just as if I was to say in my house, if I'm not going to let someone into my house unless they can prove to me they've had a vaccine, that's my right as a homeowner to decide who to let into my own home. And so I think there are two very different but important principles that clash with each other here. And it'd be quite interesting to know how people prioritize those two competing principles of freedom.
And then you could also start up new markets. A new airline might start up to say, actually, we don't mind if you haven't got a vaccine. So who knows, we might have more choice than ever before.
Well, thank you, Philip. Thank you, Esther. Now we have a question from no less than the TFA's very own chairman, David Campbell-Bannerman. So I feel almost obliged to ask this question on behalf of the TFA chairman. He asks this question: if there are, God forbid, any other COVID type threats in future, what legislative measures should be in place to ensure measures are properly debated, such as lockdown, before they're implemented?
Well, I mean, to be fair to the government now, I think it does now exercise that principle that nothing, they don't actually change the rules anymore until there's been a debate in Parliament and a vote in Parliament. Now, whether the debate is extensive enough is one thing. That some of them have been 90 minutes, which is clearly unacceptable, although the last one was a full day. So I think this is, to start with, the government were basically doing these things on a whim and using existing legislation to justify it. But I think they have got better in that regard. I think what's more important is that if we come back into this situation in the future, if there's another another pandemic next year, and one the year after, and one the year after that, who knows what lies in store for us. I hope we'll accept, I'm hoping that we'll accept, we can't go through this every single time. We can't lock down everybody's lives for a year at a time every single year, or we can't collapse the economy by 10% every single year. I hope that people will accept that we need to have a different approach, and I hope that approach will be to keep the economy going and trust people to make their own decisions and take the level of risk that they want to take amongst their family and friends. And if you're in a vulnerable group and you want to lock yourself away, then that's fine, and I've got no problem with that. And maybe the government should help facilitate that, but it shouldn't lock everybody down. And I hope that's what will change if we have a future pandemic.
The only little thing I think I would add into that, whilst there's definitely sort of processes in place now how we work in a lockdown in Parliament, although, as I say, I feel it's very limited and it has definitely curbed democracy. I think when the impacts and the fallout of COVID lockdown really appears sometime next year, I think it is then that there will be a greater challenge and a debate to future lockdowns. Remember, this is SARS-2, so it could well be SARS-3. And I think it is then when people start balancing up, which I said at the very beginning, what happened because of lockdown, and not just hearing the voice of Public Health England, but hearing the voice of economists and business people and mental health people and a whole array of people, educationists, and that really will be, I think, what balances sort of democracy and the voice of other people back up again. At the moment, we're all being cushioned, aren't we, through furlough, through business support, etc., etc. Really, next year will be the one where hopefully democracy will win through.
Now we're going to move on to the issue of hospitality, because I don't know about our two panelists, but it's certainly in my view the one sector of the economy, especially in areas which are in tier 3, which has been absolutely decimated, and I really fear for the existence of so many of our pubs and bars. And we have a question here from Mr. Carl Francis Pester, who works in hospitality himself. And he reflects a view which I pretty certain is reflects the view of so many people involved in hospitality. He said, we've pretty much given up trying to overcome the current lockdowns. Are any members of Parliament getting together to plan for a return to normality to overcome supply chain and other problems, as major venues will need to know in January if they can open in April? A number of us have prepared plans to help with this if they would be useful. So there we are. Carl's planning to put his sixpenneth in to help the MPs if they don't have answers themselves. But I think there's a wider question here for our panelists, is that I really fear that, I mean, I as the panelists will know, was involved in the early days of when the smoking ban was introduced, and the Freedom Association, along with obviously organisations like Forest, took a sensible view about the introduction of the smoking ban in public houses. And they've had that to deal with. They've had all sorts of problems around the cost of showing live sport on television. And now they've been faced with a plethora of rules and regulations, which they've tried their very best to deal with, only if they're in tier 3, then to be ordered to shut down. And just to clarify for those who are in our audience who are not in tier 3, just what's happened is that when we were in tier 3 before this latest lockdown, pubs and bars were allowed to open, provided that they serve alcohol, provided it was served with a substantial meal. That now has been removed from tier 3, and tier 3 bars and pubs have essentially been shut down, and that restriction has now been moved on to tier 2. So I just wonder if our panelists would give us their feelings and thoughts about this important sector of hospitality and what we're going to do for the future and how we can try and restore this vital sector back to full health.
I mean, Esther probably knows more about this than me. She's been working very closely.
Drinks a lot more.
Yeah. She's been working with the hospitality industry quite a lot over the last few months. I mean, it's absolutely tragic for pubs and restaurants, cafes. Many of them won't survive. Certainly in my constituency, many of them won't survive. And you know, the tragedy is they've gone to a massive amount of expense to be COVID compliant and put in place things in place to satisfy the government, and then they've just gone and been closed down. But just before I hand over to Esther, I think one of the points that's very important from the question is the fact that the government make decisions without any thought to how a business runs. You know, so they'll close a business down with no notice, or reopen it with no notice, not even thinking about, well, they've got to order the stock in, they've got stuff that they need to, you know, they need to use up, and all the rest of it. And you know, and I think when governments are making these arbitrary decisions, that's bad enough and it's devastating in itself. But when you make arbitrary decisions without the first idea of how a business operates and how much notice it needs in order to be able to either close down or open up, that's just another unnecessary kick in the teeth as well. And that's particularly infuriating for these industries when the government clearly shows its ignorance of how these industries operate.
Yes, so Esther's had a lot of involvement with the hospitality industry as part of her work with blue collar conservatism. So it would be particularly interesting to hear Esther's take on this.
Well, you know, when you get given the statistics that 1 in 4 pubs could be closed forever, I mean, that's, you know, a massive number of venues disappearing, jobs disappearing. And as I gave in an earlier answer, sort of a closing down of communities as well. And as Philip said, they did become COVID compliant. In fact, if you look at the list of where people have been contracting COVID, it hasn't actually been in, you know, pubs and restaurants. They're really quite low down on the list because of the investment they've put both into their staff and also the customers, some of them building outside space, as well as all of the screenings that they've done and the masks that they're wearing. But going back to the not understanding a sector, when it first closed down back in March, one of their busiest days for pubs and restaurants was Mothering Sunday, which came on that Sunday. So they'd stocked the fridge with food. They'd brought on extra people to do the shifts. They put the ale and the booze into their restaurants, and it was closed with immediate effect. And for a lot of people, you'll have remembered how people poured their ale away because it has a life a shelf life that lasts for. And so they never really thought about that. And again, when they said, you know, where was going to open on July the 4th and who was, and some of the places weren't allowed to open back up again. Again, they'd taken staff off furlough, they filled the fridges and they weren't allowed to open. Again, the 10 p.m. Sort of curfew didn't work. Speaking to local places, they said, if we have 2 sittings for us to be able to survive, 10 p.m. is too early. So not only have we got social distancing, so we've only got 2/3 of the people in there, you close us for 10, we've only really had 1 sitting. So that didn't sort of work. And then in some places, it actually changed drinking culture. People stopped working at 2 of a Friday, would drink right the way through. So that if they were people to be expecting people to be drunk by 10, they were, because they'd started drinking a lot earlier. And then they ended up tipping onto the street. So there was lots of sort of human behavior the government lawmakers didn't take into account. And remember, we are social beings. These social hubs have grown up over hundreds of years because they serve a purpose for an individual, a family, and for community. So it's not just about sort of the money and the livelihoods. It is about a need for human beings to socialize. So we have got to protect them. We have got to go for a way forward, and we've got to use, people talk about the science. Well, we've got to talk about the science, how they actually haven't been spreading COVID, the science about how we'll make places safer, and the science about human beings needing social interaction.
Just one other point I should make is that it wouldn't be so bad if this was a thriving industry at the best of times. But, you know, I think we all know that the pub sector has been struggling for many years. Each year, there's more and more pubs are closing down. So you've got an industry that's struggling to keep going at the best of times. And this is, you know, I'm the treasurer of the Association of Conservative Clubs. Every year, some more of our clubs close down because of the unequal task of keeping going. How on earth the government expects pubs and clubs to keep going after this kick in the teeth, Lord only knows. It will be impossible for many of them, particularly now they're closed at what would historically be one of the busiest times of the year.
And people might say, why did you stop and start the industry? And I think that was difficult. You know, Eat Out to help out, and we're all guns blazing, we're all getting back in there. Next minute it stopped. So I think people say we didn't have a consistency. We couldn't work to a set of rules, and we couldn't build our way out of, the fact you'd closed us down for months. And that's why the sort of the future for them is so perilous, really.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, I've been saving a couple of questions relating to Northern Ireland to see whether Sammy would be joining us. I'm still hoping he will be able to, even if it's just for the last few minutes, so we could hear from Sammy. Just a reminder for those who've joined us since I mentioned earlier that Sammy Wilson is being briefed on the developments around the border along Northern Ireland and part of the withdrawal agreement and the new arrangements which have been agreed this afternoon. But we have a question from Graham Eardley, who asks a very short, snappy question. is devolution working in what is supposed to be a united kingdom?
Well, no, I don't think it is. I mean, I'm not a fan of devolution, never have been, and never will be. And I think what's happened has proved that to be the case. I mean, often, you know, just on one basic premise of devolution, you know, basically the government gives up all the power, but still gets all the blame. So the devolution ends up being there's a huge democratic deficit there, because the people who are given the responsibility never get the blame. It always ends up being the government that gets the blame. And what you've seen all the way through, you know, Andy Burnham in Manchester, all he ever does is spend all his time blaming the government for everything. I mean, he never takes any responsibility for any decisions he takes himself. So, you know, I'm not a fan of devolution, but you know, I think it's been a bit ludicrous when you know, you've got these default administrations all making their own decisions. I mean, in Scotland, you get the feeling they've just been making different decisions for the sake of making a different decision, to be perfectly honest, to flex their muscles for Scottish independence. So, no, I mean, I'm not a fan of devolution. I think it's just an extra layers of. If what you're delivering to people is more politicians, then you can usually bet your bottom dollar that it's not a good solution for the public. And so I think it's a very fair point, and I think it has sown a lot of confusion, particularly for people in areas where they're just one side of or the other of a border. It's you know, I think it's been pretty nonsensical. So I think it's been a good argument against devolution.
I think what Philip says there, I think the accountability that went with devolution was never really thought through, which is sort of what you're saying. You know, basically it seems like they're a PR machine. They're out on the airwaves. They're sort of spending money but blaming government. And I think until they get that accountability correct, that, you know, your Burnhams, your Rotherhams, your Andy Street, your Ben Houchin can be held to account properly, I don't think devolution can work. And then it just becomes way too political. There's a standoff and a ding-dong rather than what everybody in those areas wants, which are better solutions locally for their needs. So I understand why people might think devolution's a good thing. You might say, well, look, not everything looks the same as Westminster. We want something that reflects our needs on the ground. But so far, devolution hasn't been the answer to that.
Yeah. Well, this next question raises something which very many people who I chat to have discussed with me, and that is a question from Chris Williams in Islington North. And Chris asks, is he alone in suspecting that what is going on regarding lockdowns is that the government has been hijacked by quangocrats disguised as doctors and scientists? In other words, you know, has there been too much reliance on the scientists? And is it the case that the politicians have been trying to hide behind the scientists for the decisions that were popularly theirs, or is the balance about right?
Yes, I think it's a very good question. In fact, funnily enough, from Islington North, actually, this has been one of the few occasions when I've regularly been voting with the Member of Parliament for Islington North. He's been voting against the lockdowns alongside me. So that's an unholy alliance if ever there was one. Yes, I think the premise of the question is right. I think, you know, I said earlier, you know, I can't remember voting for Public Health England to run the country at the last election, but that's in effect what seems to have happened. And Esther actually wrote a very good article around this in the papers the last week or so, in which she started it off by saying that it's entirely conceivable that if Public Health England would recommend would say to the government that, you know, we've got a cracking idea for reducing the number of deaths on the road, and what we'll do is we'll ban all vehicles from the road. And the job of politicians is to say to people like Public Health England, who have a blinkered focus on one particular area, the job of politicians is to say, well, yeah, that's all very well, and I'm pretty sure you're right, that if we banned all vehicles from the road, we probably would have fewer deaths on the road. But actually, we're not prepared to do that because of the devastating effect it would have on our freedoms, on our economy, and on our way of life, and all the rest of it. And so we're not going to do that because that's too extreme a measure for the benefits it would bring. And that's what politicians are there to do. And politicians haven't been doing that. They've just been saying, they've been taking their instructions from SAGE and from Public Health England, and they've in effect been the public spokesman for SAGE and Public Health England. And yeah, whether that's because the government didn't want to take responsibility for the decisions, and it was easier just to say, oh well, we're following the expert advice, or whether it was because they agreed with it all along and were using Public Health England and SAGE as a cover for the decisions they were making. People have to make their own mind up about that. But politicians lack courage. Government ministers lack more courage more often than other politicians do. And I suspect that it was just easier for the government to go along with Public Health England and SAGE because that was good cover for anything that might have gone wrong, to say, well, it wasn't my fault, we were just following what they said. But actually, they weren't doing the job of politicians, which is actually to say, we've got to look at everything in the round and we've got to challenge these things, and we can't just go with your blinkered focus on one aspect. We've got to look at everything. And that failure of politicians has been, that probably has been the biggest outrage in all of this, how government ministers and politicians have failed in their most basic of duties.
Thank you, Philip, for that. Now, our next question comes from very close to Philip's constituency, and that is from Roger Taylor in Halifax. Roger asks, why is it that Switzerland, New Zealand and Taiwan and Sweden and others can manage without having a lockdown, and states that it's all fine for the civil service and the public sector on full pay and pensions to dictate how the rest of us have to hide under the bed covers, and he wants the public to take responsibility. But his question, and it's one which we've not really touched on yet, and that is the role of the Prime Minister Boris Johnson in all this. And I wonder if our panelists would like to give a view as to where Boris Johnson is in all this, and the role that Boris has played as our Prime Minister.
If I can just start, because I feel it's always good to have a fellow person from gritty West Yorkshire on the call. Roger's absolutely right, and I feel very strongly about this. In fact, I made a speech about this in Parliament 2 or 3 weeks ago when we had the vote on the new national lockdown, and the point I made was pretty similar to the one that Roger was making there, and that is the point I said is that what I think is one of the most offensive things about all of this is that in effect what the government have been saying to people is, I know what's best for you, and what I've decided what is best for you is for us to collapse your business, for you to lose your job, and further down the line to have your home repossessed because you can no longer keep up with the mortgage payments. Now, how can you go around telling people that that's what's in their best interest? Well, that's what the government's been doing. And the point I made in my speech is that that's bad enough, but it's particularly offensive because, nobody at Public Health England is offering to give up their job in order to pursue this strategy. Matt Hancock isn't offering to sacrifice his own job to pursue this particular strategy. They're just expecting everybody else to sacrifice their jobs in order to pursue this particular strategy. And I think that really, really stinks. I think it's absolutely offensive. And there's no wonder that some people feel so aggrieved by the fact that there's lots of people who are immune from all of the consequences of these decisions, who are making them, that are affecting everybody else. And people shouldn't be surprised when there's a massive backlash to that, and that will really manifest itself, I think, next year when all of this particularly unravels. Next year is a year when people will lose their jobs, when the furlough schemes fully end, when the mortgage holidays come to an end, and people start having their homes repossessed. I think there'll be a big proper backlash next year to all of these people who have made these decisions, who weren't prepared to make any sacrifices themselves.
I think as well, when you talk about the different reactions in different countries and how did they not need to do the lockdown and follow the sort of the individual and the personal responsibility, I think a lot of that comes from clear, consistent messaging too. So when does the public have trust in its leaders? It's when it sees a sort of a consistent messaging, and that builds trust. It builds confidence, it builds faith in you as an individual to follow those rules. And I don't think we had that here. It's a bit like a bad driver, your foot's on and off the brake, off and starting and this, that, and the other, and we all feel sick from the journey and then start doing our own thing. So I think that, difference in that clear, consistent messaging, and also, different countries have different cultures and sort of attitudes to the way they react to things. I think we're very much, a country that is all about independence, and we'll do things and figure out our own way, and resilience and being resourceful. Going then back to Boris, I wonder, and I don't know, I'm not in cabinet anymore, and I'm not in that close circle, but I just wonder whether Boris being affected by COVID himself and being the small percentage of people that ends up really ill and on, a ventilator, I just wonder whether that has altered his view, known as, a libertarian. I'm just wondering whether that dampened his desire for a libertarian sort of approach, and whether he then was taken hostage by all the Public Health England and the doctors, and just listening to that single message, health, 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 all the way. Whereas, as Phillip said, the job of a politician is to hear that warning, but then balance up everything else. And that everything else is coming next year. The health bits now. And I'll leave this with other people. I do this all the time. If I find out anybody's had COVID, or if they know of somebody with COVID, I say to them, and how ill were they? What happened? Did they recover? Did they end up going into hospital? And I'd love people to start doing that now, because I can honestly say I don't know anybody personally who's had COVID. It's all been kind of quite removed from me. And the people who I do know, friends of friends, have said it's been like a really bad flu. They've got over it, or for some people who say it wasn't that bad. So I think we just need to get everything in perspective. Start asking people now, who do you know and how bad was it? Because remember, in the year 2017 to 2018, just of the regular flu, 50,000 people in this country died just from the flu. Now, I know we're up to 60,000, but just think of all of the things we've done: curtail freedoms, curtail livelihood, destroyed the economy. Just think of all those things that we've done.
I'm just going to ask a couple more questions before we wrap up. A couple of quick, short, snappy ones. The first one links together this question of the science and the politics. Jonathan Drake asks, is it time for a body to be set up with the task to evaluate all the science that actually leads to policies, a red and blue team approach, perhaps? Think we need another body trying to assess the science dispassionately, or?
I'm never a big fan of setting up new bodies. A new quango, again, it's the same thing. If the answer's a new quango, then you're asking the wrong question. And so, no, I think that's just the job of the government. That's what politicians in the government should be doing. That's what they're elected to do, to take these decisions. I don't think we want another panel doing that kind of thing, sticking their oar in as well. I think we just want politicians to do what they're elected to do, which is to take everything into account and make a sensible political decision. That's what I want to see.
And then I think finally, a very good question from Tim Scott. Should all powers that have been taken by the government, all the powers, be handed back once we get through this and out the other end?
Well, whilst I think that would be wonderful, my fear is that they'll say we've never got through it and out the other end, and there will always be some way of delaying us getting those powers back. And I think that is the battle which will come next year. I mean, you said it at the start, David, the sort of this new normal. We've got to power on through that and make sure we get basically it's about holding the powerful to account, making sure the public have their voice heard. And the one thing I would like looked into, which sort of alludes a little bit to an answer Philip gave earlier, when this was all about building capacity for the NHS, for the intensive care wards and the hospitals. What happened to those Nightingale hospitals? How many billions did we hand over? Why aren't people with COVID needs going there? 7 of them across the country. So I think there's lots of questions that are going to come next. And why did they make those £1 billion decisions when they couldn't ever fill them with staff or make them sort of COVID compliant?
Yeah, Tim's right. The government do need to give up these powers, but the problem, I think Esther's right. I don't think they will. And of course, what they'll do is they'll use this as a reason as to why they always need to have these powers in reserve to act swiftly if anything like that happens again. And actually, for me, the pandemic has been a really good reason as to why the government shouldn't have these powers in reserve, to be perfectly honest, and should have to come and get them each time they want them. But I think the chance of that happening are remote. I mean, governments, and particularly the civil service, because they're always in government, they want to keep these powers in perpetuity. It's...
And just an example, we voted against the extension of the emergency powers. How many people were in that lobby with us voting against the government having an emergency powers going forward? Was it like 6?
That was I can't remember which vote was which.
So what I'm saying is, think of all of those MPs who should have said now emergency powers are for emergency. We're 6 months in. You really don't need them going forward. Well, trust me, there wasn't very many brave MPs saying or doing that and wanting proper debate, discussion and questioning on the floor of the House.
And I think therein lies the perfect reason why anyone who is watching in on this webinar, who isn't a member of the TFA, should join, because believe you me, the freedoms of this nation and every citizen in it are under more threat today than they have been in a generation, in many generations. As was said at the outset by our panelists, the restrictions that have been placed on our individual freedoms are completely unprecedented. Even in times of world war, we have never seen restrictions like this. And so if you feel strongly that our freedoms need to be defended, and you're not a member of the TFA, just go to tfa.net, click on join and become a member today. Well, it just leaves for me to thank our 2 panelists, Phillip Davis, Member of Parliament for Shipley, and the Right Honourable Esther McVey MP, the Member of Parliament for Tatton, to give apologies on behalf of Sammy Wilson, the DUP member from Northern Ireland, who hasn't been able to join us because of last-minute developments in the ongoing saga of our relationship with the European Union, of course, which is yet another battle which the TFA has proudly been involved with. And so thank you to one and all for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you'll attend and watch another TFA webinar before too long. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.